Thank you. Last week, where we had left off was, if you recall, that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, or the real names were Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were all identified as potential great members of the court, and they were given names. We ended off, actually, if you remember, with Louis Armstrong at the last piece of the puzzle, and they were going to be trained for 3 years. And their 3-year training was to see whether or not they would be able to adopt all of the levels of education that was necessary to be a member of the king's court. And so where the Pasuk picks up, where we pick up in the story at this point, and we're in Pasuk Chet and Perek Aleph, is the following. Vayasem Daniel alibo. Daniel placed over his heart. Alibo is, in essence, the same thing as bilibo, in his heart. Asher lo yitga'al bepat bag hamelech uveyen mishtav. That he was not going to defile himself. And we use this word, yitga'al actually comes from the word, we find this use also in Micha, Gimel Aleph Lamed, to be a defilement or to be profaning himself. It actually is more common use as Gimel Ayin Lamed. The Aleph and Lamed sometimes will find a being able to be switched mitchalfim, but it's very unusual. He won't be defiling himself with the patbag, with the daily portion of food from the king or from the wine that he would drink. Vayivakesh misara sarisim asher lo yitga'al. And he made a request of the Sarisim, who was over him, the minister who was over this whole operation, that he should not be defiled. Now, there's a problem with this phrase. And the problem comes immediately with the fact that this is an insult to the king. The king goes ahead, I'm going to give you the best food, I'm giving you everything great, and then you go ahead and decide that you're not going to do this. So how is it possible for him to go ahead and make this kind of request? Which leads to a number of different possibilities. And first of all, we start out with the Malbim. And I actually, for those online, I apologize. I only prepared this sheet early this morning. And so I didn't send it over to you, but I'm going to read the sheet. It's actually just 3 different approaches of this piece. One is from the Malbim, who just says very simply, Vayasem Daniel alibo, that Daniel places it in his heart. Says the Malbim, Daniel chashav ki yichedoto lavodat elilim. That Daniel imagined that what was happening here was that the king had identified him to be part of the service of idolatry. He was putting him aside. That was part of the task. He wanted to move him away from his belief, his religion. And that the food he was giving them was specifically food that was used in the process of Avodah Zarah. It was going to be zivchei meitim, which was the way they would do it from sacrifices that were given for the dead, and the yayin, the wine that they'd use for libations for the Avodah Zarah. And as a result, he mentions, Uvamed yesh mefarshim shepirei shem pat bag pat hanikrav lavodat elilim. And in fact, the Malbim notes that some people suggested this food was specifically food that was going to be used for Avodah Zarah. Now, having said all of that, Daniel finds himself in this quandary. And the quandary he finds himself is, how is it possible for him to even participate in this? And the Malbim takes an approach that he can't. And so he takes that risk. However, the Abarbanel in his commentary on Sefer Daniel, and I mentioned it, that the Abarbanel's commentary is called Mimaynei HaYeshua, or Mimaynei HaYeshua. He says that it doesn't seem to work. Even though many of the Meforshim will say that Yitgael, that this idea of Gimel Aleph Lamed is the same as Gimel Ayin Lamed, that he won't profane himself, we know that the more common usage of the word Gimel Aleph Lamed is redemption. Asher lo Yitgael, where he says, in other words, that he will not redeem himself, he will not find the Geula via this portion of the king, and he says, Asher lo yitga'al, and he won't redeem himself. How is it possible? So says the Abarbanel, V'omnam, beperush asher lo yitga'al amru ha'mefarshim shum inyan lichluch v'tinuf. Most their Mefarshim will say that this is this kind of thing of defiling himself, that it means to dirty himself. Vahal Ralbag, and he quotes the Ralbag, Gershonides Piresh B'Shem Aviv, in the name of his father, Milashon HaGeula. It really does come from the word Geula, redemption. Hu al mishkal yishrashu hefech l'shoresh. He says, however, we find this fascinating thing with Hebrew words that sometimes the very same word in a different form can mean the exact opposite. Yishrash means to uproot, shoresh means a root. So the same thing, he says, as if he's saying, Shelo yafsiko alav ki im yochlu mipata goyim v'yishtu mi'enam titrabe ahava b'neihem v'ulai yitchatnu behem v'kamram zal gazru al yenam mishum b'notehem. And he says he's not going to remove himself from his ultimate redemption by God, because if he drinks from this wine and he eats from the food of the king, it's going to cause them to become too close. And it could be, as we see elsewhere in Chazal, the idea that we have, for example, of stam yenam. We don't drink wine produced by non-Jews, even though there's no longer a source of idolatry associated with it. We don't drink it because we want to maintain a certain distance between us and non-Jews. In social settings, we want to have some kind of distance. That's the same reason that we have the principle in halacha of ma'achole akum, of not eating food that was fully prepared by a non-Jew without any involvement by a Jew, even though the food is 100% kosher. It's one of the famous mistakes, by the way, that people make. I hear often about people going on cruises and things, and what they do is they get the piece of salmon, they tell me, and it's raw salmon, and they see that it's double wrapped, and the non-Jewish waiter shows them everything's double wrapped, everything's sealed, and he takes it, he cooks it, he brings it back to them, and they got kosher food. And the reality is the food's prohibited to eat because the non-Jew cooked it fully. Okay, if you'd want to do something like that, what you'd need to do is make sure it's double wrapped, make sure it's sealed in some fashion so that there was no question, and go over to that oven as an Ashkenazi and adjust the temperature. Okay, if they would allow you to be somewhat involved in the cooking process, you'd be okay. If they're not going to allow you, it's not kosher. And the reason is because we want to maintain social distance. So the Ralbag says that Ga'al really does mean redemption. But Ga'al in an alternative verb form can sometimes mean the opposite of redemption. But he says, V'yoter nachon, I'm in the fourth paragraph, but yoter nachon etzli lefaresh, ha'gu'ula hefech ha'galut. That no, when we talk about Geula, it's the opposite of Galut. Okay, Geula is redemption, Galut is exile. That's it. V'sheyitga'el hu mitpa'al min ha'geula. And the word Yitga'el is a form of mitpa'el on the word Geula. It still means redemption. We aren't losing this word redemption. Ulefi sheNebuchadnezzar higla Daniel v'chaverav, and since Nebuchadnezzar was the one who exiled Daniel and his companions, v'tziva l'telem mimachalim hatovim haolim al shulchano, and he gave them a command to give them from this good food which was on his table. L'chein Daniel chashab livo shelo haya ra'ui she'avadim hagolim yochlu ma'achalei hasarim. He thought it was inappropriate for these prisoners, the people who were in exile, to eat from the food of ministers, because if they would participate in the king's food, it would be symbolic of the fact that they no longer were exiles. He didn't want to do that. And so Daniel originally asked from the Saras Sarisim, and we'll see in a moment later from the waiter, Shuhu Hayam Mimunet Tachat Yado, who was under the Sarisim, that these people who were over him, the non-Jews, you take the fancy food. And he said, I just want to take the vegetarian food. I'm going to take different kinds of seeds. I'm going to take rice. Just give me simple food. ואף על פי שכוונת דניאל באמת בזה הייתה לתכלית הפרישות והקדושה, even though Daniel's whole purpose on this was to separate himself, he wanted to find sanctity. He didn't want to get that involved. והנה מפני דרכי שלום נתן הסיבה הנזכרת לשר הסריסים ולמצר לומר שהמאכלים המה והיין ההוא מאכל מלאכים והם היו גולים. He said Daniel's real reason is he didn't want to eat this at all. He didn't want to eat the tray food. He didn't want to get too close to the king in that social kind of setting. He didn't want to be too beholden in that sense. On the other hand, he gave this reason to the Sarasarisim that, you know what, we're not fit to eat such royal food. We're prisoners, we're exiles. How can we eat this? It's just not right. It's not the right way to go. And when he said, I don't want to have this geula, שלא יעשו עצמן דניאל וחבריו כאנשים נגאלים באותם המאכלים ויין והרקח, אבל שיאכלו מן הזרעונים וישתו מים קרים על נפש עייפה כמנהג העבדים הגולים. He said, but rather what he told the person over him, the one who was supposed to be taking care of him, he said, listen, we're not up there. We shouldn't be eating these kinds of foods. We're lowly exiles, and as a result, we ask of you to just give us the kind of food we should be eating, not the kind of food that's being offered to us right now. Now, if you think about it, what's happening in this situation is a fascinating piece, because what's really happening right now is the king, in one way or another, one possibility is he's trying to drag him into idolatry. The other possibility is he's trying to bring him into a situation where they're going to be fully part, socially and politically, part of the king's court. Whichever way we go, he's trying to bring him in. Daniel is trying to refuse. Now, I have two ways of saying how he's trying to refuse. One way he says the person over him, the minister, high minister in the king's court, I can't have this disgusting stuff. That's one way. Now, if he tells him, I can't have this disgusting stuff, it's not PC. And when you're not PC in a king's court like Nebuchadnezzar, he can take your head off for it. It's pretty insulting. And so maybe that's what he said, and we'll see one way of explaining it that way. The Abarbanel says, no, he's being completely PC. He's saying, you know, this is really extraordinary what the king's doing for us, but who are we to take it? His real intent was, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy. But the way he conveyed it was, this is food that is above our status. And so we're not going to take it. And what's fascinating is the very next pasuk, because it says in pasuk tet, "Vayiten Elokim et Daniel lechesed u'lerachamim lifnei sar hasarisim." God made Daniel to have grace and mercy in the eyes of the sar hasarisim who was before him. Now, according to the approach of the Ralbag, the approach of the Malbim, the approach of so many others, this was necessary because Daniel had just insulted them. And if Daniel had just insulted them, how did he get away with it? God intervened. Okay, that's one possibility. And in fact, according to the Malbim, we're going to see an example of it in the very next pasuk. According to the Abarbanel, it's still that the Sarasarisim is going to tell him, I want to help you, must have been divine in some nature. But it isn't that he wasn't insulted, because what Daniel said to him was not insulting. He said to him, you're so great, and this is so great, and I'm so low, I shouldn't be, I can't accept this kind of gift. Yeah.
He could have taken another approach. He could have said to them, you brought me here for my brains, to teach you some things. Let me teach you something about food.
Well,
he could have made it part of his lesson.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting because the Abarbanel is going to pick up a little bit on that in a moment, because the end of this parak, comes, and this is what's happening is he's asking that he wants to basically eat vegan, okay, which calls into question Daniel's wisdom, but he wants to eat vegan, right? That was a joke, but he wants to eat vegan. As a result, they're going to say, if you eat this vegan food and these other children are going to be eating real food, you're going to come before the king and you're going to be gaunt and you're going to not look healthy and everything else. And at the end of the puzzle, at the end of this parak as well, we see that he comes before the king and he looks healthier than anybody else around. And the Abarbanel actually says that eating that kind of food is healthier, and meat had various kinds of diseases associated with it, and he came out ahead in the whole picture. So it could be that he's trying to say, hey, I'm going to teach you, and this is the healthiest stuff around.
Abarbanel probably never had a good job.
That's it. So says the pasuk, Vayomer Sar Hasarisim LeDaniel. So after God had given the grace to Daniel, so the Sar Hasarisim tells him, Yarei ani et Adoni HaMelech asher mina et malchalchem bet mishtechem. Listen, I appreciate what you're telling me, but my boss, he's kind of scary. His name is Nebuchadnezzar. He's not one of these warm, fuzzy people. Asher lama yiret pnechem zoafim min hayeladim asher kigilchem. He's going to go ahead and he's going to see that your faces are going to be faces zoafim. Zoafim generally means angry. Okay, that what he basically says, the Reb Sajagon says on this, that someone who is in pain looks like that face. How does that spell? Ill at ease. Okay, so basically he's saying, look, you know what? You want to eat what you want to eat. The king wants you to eat something different. You eat what you want to eat, and you're going to come before the king, and you're not going to look as good as everybody else looks. Now, the Yeladim Asher Kigilchem, interestingly, that this means that Dr. Mikra points this out, that going through this whole process, there were the Jews, if you remember the list of people that Nebuchadnezzar had wanted, basically he wanted to have the elite, the children of the elite, to go through this 3-year training to see if they would be fit and they could be trained in all of the knowledge they would need to be in the royal court. But it wasn't just Jews. Anyone he captured, any nation he had conquered, he would take the children of the elite. And we talked about it before, that this was also one of the ways, and we had seen this happen even in Sefer Melachim, one of the ways that one government could make sure, the conquerors could make sure that the conquered would behave themselves. Because at the very same time, not only is he trying to find the elite who will then be able to serve him in his court, he's also kidnapped all the children of the leadership. And so if the leadership tries to plot, they'll kill the children. So it's another way of making sure it wasn't just the Jews. So Kigilchem is not the only ones. And Kigilchem, nowadays in modern Hebrew, Gil is a word that we use for age. And this is the only place that this verb is found in Tanakh. Okay, noun is found in Tanakh. Rashi says, okay, Ben Gilo means that a Ben Gilo is a person who's born at about the same time within the same mazal, within the same zodiac. The Medrash Daniel, who we've been learning and will continue to learn because it's a classic commentary, even though it's only been published recently, 1968 was when it was first available to people. He says that Gil would be translated more like cohort, that the children who were within that same year of when you were born, not immediately exactly the same age, but that group of kids, nowadays we might say the same class, okay? Same class, same cohort. So Kigilchem, the Malbim says, now ultimately, if I give you what you want, this is the pshat, the king is going to look and he's going to see you don't look the same. V'chiyavtem et roshi lamelech, and as a result, if you do this, the king is going to have my head. Vayomer Daniel el ha-Meltzar. So now Daniel turns to the Meltzar. Again, this is the first appearance in Tanakh where we have this word Meltzar, which we all know, the waiter. Okay. Now, Meltzar, again, in this context, Reb Sajagon says Machsanai, the person who was responsible over the Machsan, over the storehouses. Rashi says, very simply, it's the person who put out the portions of the food, the waiter. Okay, the Dat Mikra points out, and I saw this also in the Anchor Bible edition as well, that this comes from Akkadian, okay, matzaru, which means the person who is the guard, and in Hebrew we have the same word of notzar, a person who is a guard, and that's okay. So we have that concept of meltzar is come from the same word as the person who guards, who's in charge of this piece of the responsibility. But the strange thing here is Daniel went to the Sarah Hasarisim. The Sarah Hasarisim, he said, listen, do me a favor. I don't want to eat from the food for whatever my reasons are. And can you give me something else? He said, how can I give you something else? You're going to look different. I'm going to end up being killed for it. Did the Sarah Hasarisim deny his request? Did he say no? He didn't say no. He said, but how am I going to do that? And then immediately we find Daniel jumping over to somebody under him, the waiter, and he says, do me a favor. Get me, go in the kitchen and see if you can get me the vegetarian plate. Okay. Why does he go from one to the next? And in that, it seems to be, the Malbim seems to suggest that the Sarah Hasarisim, well, the Malbim says that the Sarah Hasarisim, by not giving an outright no, and saying that why he couldn't do was he was afraid for his life if he would take that action, left the door open for Daniel. And Daniel understood that the door was open, and he understood that at this point, if he goes ahead and he wants to, he can figure another way as long as he keeps the Sarah Hasarisim out of the picture. As long as the Sarah Hasarisim has plausible deniability, he's okay with it. He's not objecting to it. His only fear was he was going to be held responsible. And so he goes to an underling and asks him, can he take care of it? Now, the Ralbag takes a different approach. The Ralbag says no, that the Sarah Hasarisim said no. And so Daniel's just trying somebody else. But the reason why the Malbim's approach is so elegant is if the boss said no and you go to an underling, it's even riskier what you're going to do, because now you're violating that other level. And all of that really doesn't work well. And so as a result, the Malbim, I understand the Malbim a little bit better, his approach of how you go from the boss to some underling afterwards. And he turns to this, Vayomer Daniel el Meltzar, this is Pasuk 11, Yud Aleph, Asher minah Sarah Hasarisim al Daniel Hananiah Mishael v'Azariah, who had been appointed to be the personal steward, food steward for him. Nasnat avadecha yamim asara. Listen, I want you to give me the vegan dishes, and let's test this out. Test it for 10 days. V'yidnu lanu minha zeroim v'nochla umayim v'nishter. Give me just vegetables. I'll eat it, and let me just drink water. I don't want wine. I don't want meat. I don't want anything else. I just want to have vegetables and water. And let's test it. Now, nas in this case is from the word nisayon. It's a test. The Abarbanel says, interestingly, why 10 days? Okay, because 10 days is really the reasonable amount of time to see if it's going to have any impact on the person's health. And the Ibn Ezra says that ultimately, if it's not good, 10 days is basically the maximum that a human being would be able to not have a negative impact if he's eating food that would have a negative impact. For 10 days, you can make it, but up to 10 days, once you hit the 10th day, you'll see it. So let's do a test, he says. And then after 10 days, what you'll do is bring us up. You bring us, you bring the other people who are eating the other food, check us out. And then whatever you see, that's what you should do.
They have 3 years.
There's 3 years of training.
So he can do this in the 3 years and not before the king.
No problem at all. The king's not going to know anything. King won't know anything. And as long as it doesn't impact negatively their health, no one will know anything except for the Meltzar. And probably at the very same time, the Sarah Hasarisim is going to know what's going on, but he'll be able to deny any knowledge of it if he's ever approached. So the other children might know about it, or maybe they're in separate cells. We don't know. We don't know exactly the arrangement. It could have been that they were all together and they're getting the vegetarian plate. But if it doesn't have any impact on them, then maybe the others are all not going to say anything. The biggest concern is that Nebuchadnezzar shouldn't find out that they refused his generous offer. Again, it's generous offer according to most. According to the Malbim, it was a very devious offer, because by wanting to give him food that's associated with idolatry, he's trying at the very same time. I guess it would be the analogy today is to take a child and be serving him pork, specifically pork versus something, versus something that is at least kosher style. Vayishma lahem ledavar hazeh, and so the Meltzar listens to it. Vayinasem yamim asara, and he tests them out for 10 days. Umiktzat yamim asara, and at the end of those 10 days, miktzat means a little, right? Just a ktzat, but ktzat also comes from the word ktsei, which is the edge, the end. And so at the end of those 10 days, nir emarem tov, they looked really good. Uvriye basar, and they were healthy. Mina yiladim ochlim et pat bagamelech, from all the children who were eating, the other children who were eating the king's portions. Now, I mentioned to you already the Abarbanel. Abarbanel says by nature that a vegetarian diet is healthier than a meat diet, especially in his days when there wasn't refrigeration and all the rest of the things present. The Malbim says, but the Malbim rejects it. He must have had the good Cholensberry, and he said it was a miracle. It was a miracle that happened. Okay. Vayehi Meltzar noset pat bagam v'yein mishtehem v'noten lehem zer onim. And what did the Meltzar do? The Meltzar, in the meantime, was getting these portions of food for these 4 young men. The 4 young men were getting, the good wine and the good meat and everything else. So what do you do with it? He went ahead. Rashi says he was no dummy. He took it for himself. Okay. And in fact, the Malbim says not only was he no dummy, he took it for himself and he was able to sell it, and he made a fortune off of the deal. Okay. Now, the Abarbanel, the Ibn Ezra is a little nicer to him. The Ibn Ezra says he's taking it, he's taking the responsibility for it. Okay. Now, but the Meltzar is in on all of this. He's buying into this. Now, this is the Nosechen. There is some kind of divine intervention in this whole story. You can't avoid seeing that. V'hayiladim ha'ela arbatam natan lahem Elokim mada v'haskel b'chol sefer v'chochma. And these 4 young men, okay, they were given by God mada v'haskel b'chol sefer v'chochma. The Malbim says that these are 3 different types of cognitive abilities. Mada is the lowest. Mada is just the knowledge, like from the word yodea, okay? Chokhmah is the next level up. Chokhmah is wisdom that is above just what you'd normally get, okay? It can be, now the seichel is even higher than that, okay? Seichel is one of those rare commodities. We know that in our world, it's a very rare commodity today, okay? It is that understanding, the ability to really evaluate situations, okay, and to understand, and they have that inherent kind of common sense. Common sense is, again, that's the seichel, that lahaskel is to understand that there is one other form of knowledge. It's binah, which we normally talk about. Binah is to understand something from something else. It's a transfer of knowledge. I know this and I understand this. It is a different level, but in this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them with the prerequisites of what they needed, because they were going to be standing before the court. They were going to be tested by Nebuchadnezzar. We'll see that in a moment. And what they were going to be tested on was language, on royal protocols, on their ability to understand things as well. Okay, and to interpret things. So those 3 pieces are what God gave them. V'Daniel hevin b'chol chazon v'chalamot. And now Daniel, this in distinction to the other 3, he was given binah, understanding something from something else. Okay, that's the highest level. And what was the binah about specifically? It was about chazon, about visions and dreams. Ulamiktzat hayamin. And now we encounter one more time that miktzat yamim, the end of the time. In this case, it's the end of 3 years. The first time was the end of the 10-day test. Now it's the end of 3 years. Asher amar hamelech laviam, which the king had said to bring him before him. Vaviem sar hasarisim lifnei Nebuchadnezzar. Now the sar hasarisim brings him. Remember we talked about the Meltzar was the guy who was, double dealing the king. But the Sarasarisim ultimately was over the responsibility. He brings them before Nebuchadnezzar for the test. Veyedaberi tam hamelech, and the king speaks with him. The Mitzudot David says that he speaks with him. He basically gives them a test. Okay. With them, with all of them, right. Okay, it gives them with a test. It's what's happening here is in Yiddish you'd say fehered them. He wanted to see what they had learned. Now the Ibn Ezra says one more piece. Vayedaber itam hamelech. It's specifically he spoke with them. What did he speak with them? He speaks with them in Babylonian, in Kastit. He wants to see their fluency of language. And so 3 years they've had a chance to become fluent. Velo nimtza mikulam ki Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, v'Azariah, and no one else had that proficiency like these four had. Vayamdu lifnei hamelech, and therefore they were the only ones, and we'd say nowadays in colloquial English, they were the only ones left standing. They were the ones who were standing before the king of everyone else. Only them, says the Ibn Ezra. Okay, all of the rest of the captive children who had gone through these 3 years of training seem to have failed the test. But says the Ibn Ezra, that doesn't include, there were other children who had gone through the 3 years from other nations who may have also passed the test as well. V'chol davar chokhmat bina, and every other aspect of understanding asher bikesh me'am hamelech vayimtzaem es yadot al kol hachartumim va'ashafim asher b'chol malchuto. And on any other matter that was asked of them, they were found to be 10 hands above everyone else. Eser Yadot is, in this case, says it's a hyperbole. They were, 10 feet above everyone else. I don't know what the right equivalency in English nowadays, but they were just well above anyone else who'd been asked. Now, in that same kind of case, who did they check? Who were they above? They were above the Chartumim, Those were the people who were, according to the Ralbag, who were well versed in natural sciences, okay, and what happens through nature. Rashi says, no, the Chartumim, they were the necromancers. They were the ones who worshipped, were sorcerers of the dead. And Ashafim, the Ashafim were the people who were sorcerers. They were looking into the zodiac, okay, or according to Mitzudot Zion, they were actually the physicians, the court physicians, or it's a possibility they were the magicians of Babylonia, which seems to be according to the knowledge nowadays of language. It seems to be that Ashafim and Chartumim, that those two roles were roles of the people who were sorcerers, but the Ashafim were Babylonian and the Chartumim were Egyptian. That they basically did the same thing. One was from Babylon, one was from Egypt. And the fascinating piece about it, if you remember, Babylonia had conquered Egypt. And so it's entirely possible that among the people he had conquered were those people. Now, when you mention the word Chartumim, and this is what I did send out to people in advance, and I'm trying to figure out where I put the rest of those sheets. I did send out to you this in advance, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I have copies for everyone. I thought I brought copies. Where did I bring it? Oh, here they are. I'm sorry. Okay. Was one interesting comparison. When you hear the word Chartumim, hopefully immediately, you think of the other case we have of Chartumim, which was with Yosef, Chartumei Paro, and then you have it later on also at the time of Paro himself, the beginning of the hardships at the beginning of Sefer Shemot. And in fact, if you think about the story of Daniel, and you think about the story of Yosef, there are a lot of parallels. And for those of you who are online right now, I'm just going to share a screen with you, and everyone else, I handed this out to them. And if you notice, and just to go down some steps of where there are comparisons, and these are not perfect comparisons, but they are some pretty close ones. And where it really comes from is if you think about the big picture for a moment, someone is taken captive, is brought into a royal home, is imprisoned, is then brought before the king, and rises to prominence in the royal court. Now, if I gave you those 5 steps, you would say Joseph. It's Yosef. Here, it's Daniel. And we see some real interesting parallels between the two, just starting from the beginning, from last week, what we had done. Yiladim, I'm reading the top right corner of the chart. Yiladim asher ein behem kol me'um v'tovei mareh. He wanted to identify people who, without blemish, had nothing. We also said might be me'uma, nothing against them. There was nothing in their background, and they were all beautiful. And Yosef is defined by Yosef Yefei Torah v'Yefei Mareh. Yosef, that's why he's described. Now, then, if you notice, and this is a tiny bit of, not 100% comparable, but there is a piece to it, that Daniel, Vayasam Daniel alibo asher lo yitga'al bepat bag hamelech v'yein mishtav, that Daniel decides he's not going to profane himself, defile himself with the king's food. And Yosef, when Eshet Potiphar tries to seduce him, he also doesn't want to defile himself. He doesn't want to sin to God. So we have this idea of them trying to maintain who they are, their religious personalities in the same way. Then Daniel, we see right now we just read that whatever was needed, that he was 10 times better than anyone else. And in Sefer Breshit, Paro declares, no one is wiser than you. Then we haven't seen this yet, but we will see this very soon. I'm sorry to highlight in this page. This is in the next parak when we transfer over to Aramaic. Okay, that Daniel asks his compatriots to pray for him to the God of heaven to help him with this mystery that he has to try to resolve. So that I won't be killed like everyone else who isn't able to resolve it. And says Yosef to Paro, Bil Adai, that all the dreams I have interpreted, Elokim Yanet Shalom Paro. Okay, that this is not me, this is God who's going to do it. So just like Daniel implores for God's assistance, Yosef says very clearly, and then we see one more case in the next paragraph that would ultimately, in the next parak, that ultimately, that Daniel is placed over all of the countries of Bavel. Yosef is an avrech v'natuno to al kol eretz Mitzrayim. He is made into this almost ruler over all of, we refer to him as a viceroy, not that we use the word viceroy too often in our common language, but he is the viceroy over all of Egypt, just like Daniel was as well. So you find these real interesting comparisons. According to Chazal, Daniel served in this role of being the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia all the way until the time of Zerubbabel, until the time of Cyrus, which we're going to see in a moment, until the Jews begin to return. Which brings us to the very last pasuk of this parak, and we will end a little early today. Only I didn't want to start into the new parak. I like doing a parak a week and try to keep the breaks as best as possible. Vayihi Daniel ad shnat achat lechoresh hamelech. And that Daniel remained in his active role until the first year of Cyrus. Now, the first year of Cyrus, if we're going to work backwards, and this most the Mefarshim take the approach that this is Cyrus the Great, who ultimately issued the decree for the Jews to return to Eretz Yisrael. So if you work your way back, Cyrus, he ruled, Daniel was 1 year with Cyrus, 1 year with Darius, who was before him, 3 years before with Belshazzar, 23 years with Avil Merodach. Okay, so if I'm doing my math so far, it's 28 years. And he is with Nebuchadnezzar, a total of 70 years. He's going to be, in other words, operating for 98 years as a leader within Klal Yisrael. And he probably started his role, according to Chazal, that Daniel was about, this is the Ralbag, was probably around 20 when he took over, which means he was doing pretty well till about 118 years old in his role. I don't know if he made the 120 or not, but he was still busy, still driving to work every day and making sure he was standing before the kings and all of their successor kings. So Daniel is this figure that we're going to be dealing with, and we're going to be finding it. It's interesting. There's another Daniel most of the Meforshim take this approach, but not all. There is a Daniel referred to in Sefer Yechezkel, but most likely that was a different Daniel. Then remember, we do have words, but some of the Meforshim say he's even older than 20. It just doesn't make sense in terms of the age, why he would be called one of the young elite, if it's the same Daniel who's mentioned already as having risen to greatness in the book of Yechezkel. Yeah, Barry, you had a
What
question?
about the other 3 guys?
The other 3 guys, we don't know that they ruled that long, that they were necessarily around that long. Daniel was. Daniel is the leader of the crew in this case. He's the leader of the crew. Next week, we're going to get together the same way. We'll continue to do this hybrid model. It's a little bit more complicated, just like when teaching hybrid classes a little more. And if anyone who's online feels at any point, okay, Sid, it's your job, feels that you're being ignored because there are people in person, just wave a lot or ask whatever questions you need to ask. Okay, everyone, it's good to be back. And we'll see everyone. And I thank the Seamers for providing coffee this week. And next week we'll have coffee again.
There's also Danishes.
Oh.